Alright, so as promised, I'm going to be giving a pre-recorded lecture for the week. So this is on what I believe is Chapter 12, Principles of Test Selection and Administration. Up to this point, we've given you guys a solid background on a lot of the finer details of physiology, biomechanics, all the things that matter at the smaller level. I think this is the first major lecture, at least maybe not, I'm forgetting about loading methodology, but the first major lecture regarding the big picture stuff. We have to understand what our clients need, and we have to understand what tools we have at our disposal to assess what our clients need, and then how do we actually administer these tests. So this is the very, very important stuff, and probably more important than we initially think. So why do we need to assess or test? There's many reasons to test. There are some reasons where we would not test, some situations. I think first and foremost is the obvious, where we need to evaluate the current status of a client or an athlete. Where are they coming from? How long have they been training? Have they been training? Do they have any injuries or any limitations? We need to figure all of these things out. So that's one reason. Next would be we need to identify their strengths and weaknesses. So we assess. From there, we can figure out, based on normative data or based on anecdotal experience, we can figure out whether or not their strength is in one area or they have a weakness in a different area. And percentile charts, all of these things are helpful. Next, and maybe one of the most important, is goal setting. If somebody is trying to accomplish some sort of goal, how do we know whether or not it's achievable or not? Somebody says they want to make the Olympics. Well, if they want to make the Olympics and they're 25 years, 26, 27 years old, and they want to make the Olympics in, let's say, in weightlifting, and they're 100 kilos or 100 kilograms off the standard to qualify for the Olympics, odds are those goals might not be realistic. The acronym is SMART goals, right? Part of SMART is being realistic. So we need to assess so we can set realistic goals. Additionally, by testing or assessing, we can start to build a plan to get to those goals. And the next one is evaluate the progress. So if we are assessing and we are creating goals, these goals can be short, medium, and long-term. If we create long-term goals, long-term being something like at least 6 months, but usually we're talking like a year out on a long-term goal, we probably need to retest and reassess to make sure we're making progress to get to the goals. So if you set a goal 1 year out, you don't want to just blindly go into your training. You want to be able to evaluate your progress with more tests and more assessments. And then hopefully, if you are continuously evaluating the progress of the client and you've developed a good plan for the client, these tests and assessment over time should build confidence because they are progressing, right? So if we're progressing, it should build confidence in the client, and then they have a bigger buy-in, and then they're even more devoted to training, and it'll increase the trust in you as well. Now, there's some situations where you wouldn't test. I think the most obvious is if somebody's completely new to a sport, right? So if somebody walks into you, a client walks into you on day one, they say, I want to be as strong as possible, right? You get their background, I don't know, let's say it's a 40-year-old woman, she just wants to be as strong as possible for whatever reason, but she's never lifted before. In that situation, you are probably not going to assess her by doing a 1 repetition maximum, right? Because a 1 repetition maximum is the gold standard for assessing strength, but we're not going to do that to a brand new client, right? So we wouldn't do that if she's completely new. A few other ones are if you know a client is behind. So what I mean by this is, let's say you create a training plan after you've done an initial assessment and you just by watching your client, you know that they're not on pace to achieve their goals. And if you think that they know that, it is going to be psychologically inappropriate. So if you know that a client is behind pace, and if you know that they find out that they're behind pace, it is going to upset them. So like case in point, best example is like weight loss clients, right? Some people become very obsessed with the scale, right? Very obsessed with the scale. And if they see that they haven't lost weight, or if that they've, God forbid, put on weight, right? They are completely crushed, and they start to question everything, question life, and all of a sudden, you know, for them, who knows, it might spur the onset of some sort of binge eating, whatever it is, right? There might be times where it's just inappropriate for a specific client to actually do any sort of assessment or test. And the last thing is called a secret test. What this essentially means is if you're working with a client in the gym, you should have some workouts that you have a general idea of how well or how poorly somebody should perform on them. And if you have a general indication, you don't need to share it with the client, right? You could just know like somebody crushed a workout, and in your head, a workout should correlate with a final end result, but you don't have to share it with the client. You don't always have to share these things with the client. Just as a coach, take note of these things, move on, and hopefully they continuously track or trend in the right direction. These are some videos. We're not going to go over them, obviously, while I'm doing a pre-recorded lecture, but I highly encourage you to watch them. One is just a video of Saquon Barkley going through his combine. Coincidentally, as I've recorded this, this is the day after Saquon Barkley has rolled his ankle in the last Giants game. Saquon Barkley scored incredibly well at his NFL combine, and I think I can say fairly confidently that his combine ended up boosting his draft stock. Now, oftentimes we correlate assessments with performance, right? If somebody scores really well on an assessment, they can perform really well in sport. So Saquon Barkley scored incredibly well. In addition, he played very well in college, and we would think that would translate very well into the professional level, but it does not always. As is the case with Saquon Barkley, he's had a very rough history with injuries, ACL, now last night was ankle. He's had an ankle before the ACL, and his career up to this point has been absolutely, I think, a disappointment by his standards, by what we would have expected from him. The second link on here is an actual link talking about comparing, before the combine, comparing NFL or NBA standout Greg Oden to Kevin Durant. Greg Oden went number 1 in the draft, and that was followed by Kevin Durant. And Kevin Durant ended up scoring really poorly on his NBA combine, really poorly. And Greg Oden scored really well on his combine. And if you don't know the history, Greg Oden is no longer in the NBA, a big injury history, and Kevin Durant is going to go down as one of the greatest scorers of all time. So assessment, while it correlates with performance, it's not the be-all, end-all. Performance is performance. So just some quick terminology from your text that you should know. So what is a test? It's a procedure for assessing ability. We test you guys. We assess your knowledge in school. In strength and conditioning, we assess people based on athletic ability, or we're looking to determine their athletic ability. A field test is a test performed away from the laboratory in a real-world setting. Evaluation is the analyzing the test results for decision making. So when you assess, you will evaluate the assessment and then determine what's the best training methodology. Pre-test, post-test, testing in the beginning prior to a training intervention, post-test, testing after an intervention. Hopefully we're seeing some sort of improvement. So some things that you should absolutely know when applying tests are validity and reliability. At the very basic level, you have to understand the difference between validity and reliability. Validity can be defined as the degree to which a test measures what it intends to measure. And there are several subforms of validity, with the main one being construct validity. So construct validity is when a test measures some sort of specific construct. What's a specific construct? Okay, a specific construct is something like a test for strength. I already said the 1RM is the gold standard to assess strength. The construct there is strength, right? If somebody is assessing something like aerobic capability or cardiovascular health, we could actually use both of those, right? The gold standard for that, right, you guys should know, is a VO2 max test, right? A VO2 max test is like a gold standard for aerobic capability, and the construct is aerobic capability. Face validity is the degree to which a test appears to measure its construct, right? So an example of this is a bench press, right? Clearly looks like it measures total body strength because you're lifting heavy weights, right? So it has high face validity. Something that might have low face validity is something like the hand grip dynamometer, right? So the hand grip dynamometer might actually have low face validity because you wouldn't get it on the surface that if you can squeeze something really hard, it's going to translate really well to overall body strength. All right. So content validity is the content, or the degree to which the content actually measures those constructs. Okay. Criterion reference validity. A clear example of criterion reference validity is body fat testing. So the gold standard typically depends on who you talk to. The gold standard is typically a hydrostatic weigh-in or the dunk tank. And typically what we do is we reference certain tests compared to the dunk tank. So for example, skin fold calipers can be correlated with the dunk tank, and that's how we determine that skin fold calipers are a valid measure of body composition. So kind of moving forward, because I don't want to make this video too long, especially from on a week off or a Monday off, let's go to reliability. So reliability is the degree of test, retest, reproducibility. So if you test somebody, right, you mark them off on a certain score, and you test the exact same person, they should produce similar results if you test them right away. You know, all things being equal, fatigue, being attenuated. So there's several subforms of reliability, just like validity. So one might be intra-subject variability, another might be intra-rater variability. So an example of intra-subject variability is something like squat depth, right? So if you have a client come in and they have to squat to a certain depth, they come in week 1 with squat shoes. They do a 1RM test on a back squat, right? And you measure, make sure their depth is appropriate, good, right? Then when they do the post-test, let's say 8 weeks later, and they forgot their lifting shoes, and all of a sudden they can't get to appropriate squat depth. Is that test reliable? The reliability might not be there. So you want to control for as many confounding variables like gear, like squat shoes, as possible. Intra-rater variability is something like the functional movement screening. Those of you that are familiar with the functional movement screening, there is going to be a degree of rater subjectivity. So if you don't know what the functional movement screening is, I highly recommend you look it up. It's on YouTube, but it's a test where you assess 7 different movements and you score the movements. It is a subjective score, and if you have 2 different people scoring a test, they may give different scores because it's a subjective test. So there might be a reliability issue with the person that's actually scoring it. And here's just a graphic of what validity and reliability can kind of look like, right? We want that picture on the right. We want, right, these shots to be tightly packed. What does tightly packed mean? That means it's reliable, right? So on the left, right, they're tightly packed, but they're not hitting the target we intend to hit, so it's not valid, right? On the third picture, or excuse me, on the second picture, right, it is, they're not tightly packed. It's not reliable, but it's sort of around the target. So okay, The right is what we want, where it's tightly packed, it's reliable, and it's around our target, it's measuring what we intend to measure. So we want something that is both reliable and valid. So when deciding what tests to apply, there's many different variables you have to consider. So as an S&C, you got to think about metabolic specificity. You know, am I going to do a beep or pacer test on a sprinter or a shot putter? No, they train different energy systems, right? We come back to our energy systems, right? Your phosphocreatine, your glycolytic, your oxidative system. We need to make sure our assessment is metabolically specific. What about biomechanical specificity, right? So for something like if we're trying to test lower body power, is it better to do a Margarita-Kalaman test or a vertical jump test? If you don't know what those tests are, well, the vertical jump you should know is where you just come down and up and you hit the little things at the top and we assess your vertical jump, whether it's 27 inches or 37 inches, right? That's your lower body power. The Margarita-Kalaman is also a lower body power test, but it's where you run up stairs, right? Both tests are very short. They're very valid assessments of power, but one is going to be a little bit better for a basketball player. Obviously, the vertical jump is going to be a little bit more appropriate for a basketball player because it's more biomechanical specific for their sport. Other things you got to consider a client's experience, their training status, age and sex. So you know, for age and sex, like females just really struggle with the pull-up. So a pull-up test might not be appropriate for females, right? For older males, I should say. Older males, for the general population, most older males can't do pull-ups. Might not be appropriate for them, right? And then environmental factors, testing in heat, testing under pressure, all these other things. Other elements to consider when you're actually doing tests is the health and safety. That kind of goes back to environmental factors. You know, if you're doing something like a beep test or any type of VO2 max test outside as a field test, you got to be careful in something like heat or icy conditions. Making sure water is available. Testing administrators, you got to be careful with subjective errors. You have to make sure every tester is on the same. They know what they're looking for. Right? When you're testing, if you're testing in large groups, make sure you have test forms readily available. And I think the most important here on this slide is the proper testing format or sequence, which I believe is on the next slide. So, proper testing sequence, right? This is the NSCA model for the proper testing sequence straight from your textbook. We got to be careful because if you guys come from an ACSM background, it's slightly different. But what it should say is, so we've got non-fatiguing tests first. So your non-fatiguing tests or assessments are something like, okay, we put them on a scale and assess their body weight, body fat, height. These are things that are non-fatiguing. Other things that are non-fatiguing might be something like the vertical jump. So even though it is a power test, it is a non-fatiguing test. So after that, you would do something like a short agility test, like a T-test. From there, you go into maximum power. We're talking about something like a clean and jerk or a snatch. Maximum strength would be some sort of 1 RM or 3 RM. Sprint tests, local muscular endurance test, anaerobic test, and finally aerobic test, because aerobic tests like the beep test or graded exercise test are the most fatiguing. So I had to switch locations, but just to wrap things up, we've got 2 more slides. This first slide is really the testing metrics, or what you would consider the testing constructs. So earlier we talked about construct validity. What are you assessing? And these really cover the gamut of what you would assess as an S&C coach or personal trainer, right? So one would be maximum muscular strength, and that's really assessing the amount of force a muscle or a group of muscles can produce. And as we should know, the repetition maximum, specifically the 1 repetition maximum, is the test of choice. The next would be maximum muscular power. This is the ability to exert high degrees of force at relatively high speeds. And these, for the most part, should last like a second or less, with the exception being the Wingate test, which is slightly different. Anaerobic capacity is maximal power output of tests lasting 30 to 90 seconds. So usually these are like incline hill sprints of some sort. Local muscular endurance. An example of a local muscular endurance test might be something along the lines of a 60-second push-up test or something like that. And then for aerobic capacity, typically we're looking at the maximum rate to produce energy using the oxidative energy system. So for here, typically VO2 max is what we're looking at, and there's all sorts of tests for this, like graded exercise test, or the Pacer beep test, the Ebling walking test. So there's many tests for that. Another construct might be agility, and we define agility as the ability to change direction rapidly. It's important to make sure we distinguish between agility and something like acceleration. Speed is movement per time. Typically when we're assessing speed, we're assessing distances less than 200 meters. So like one lap around the track isn't really an assessment of speed per se. That's probably more so anaerobic capacity, because one lap around a 400-meter track typically takes about 60 seconds, 90 seconds, depending on the person. Flexibility is the range of motion about a joint. For this, we might use something like a goniometer and measure degrees of motion. For body composition, it's an assessment of fatness versus leanness. And for this test, typically we could do a lot of different things. I spoke earlier, we could do the gold standard, which might be considered the hydrostatic weigh-in or the dunk tank. You could do the bod pod, you could do a DEXA. The cheaper alternatives might be skin fold calipers, which I use often at my gym. Or you could do like one of the cheaper bioelectric impedance analysis tests. And anthropometry is the measurement of bodily proportions, so simply assessing like limb length, things like that. The last is really just me reiterating what I just went over. For max power, kind of what we would assess, snatch, clean and jerk, vertical jump. The important thing here for you guys is you should know these tests and you should be familiar with these tests. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and link one example of every single test in a separate document. They're YouTube videos, and what I want you to do is just watch every single one. So if I describe a test, you should be able to identify what test I'm describing because you've seen it done before.